all of these things I've been speaking about, they all make up a body of psychology you may have heard of called Neurolinguistic Programming, or NLP for short. And NLP, what it does basically is it deals with specifically how people make change in their lives and how to actually make sure those changes last. And when NLP is used correctly, it can be an incredibly potent tool for making changes in your own life, and specifically in this context, when it comes to learning how to manage your own state through the process of anchoring. And just so you know, I liken NLP to almost like an incredibly sharp sword. Like there was this movie I loved called Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and they had this magical sword, right? And the sword was, invented thousands of years ago, a lost art. No one could have this sword anymore. But if the wrong person wielded the sword, it wasn't all that powerful. But in the hands of a highly trained expert, the sword becomes an almost magical weapon. Well, the same is true of NLP. NLP can be incredibly effective when used by the right person, and also if someone shows you how to integrate certain aspects of NLP into your own life. But that's a very, very rare thing. I had the benefit myself of actually training directly with the person who founded the body of psychology of NLP, a man named Dr. Richard Bandler. And I spent a lot of time with Dr. Bandler, thankfully, and he blew me away. And what I came away with is this. In many ways, NLP is almost about stating the obvious about the world around us, the way it operates, how we make sense of the world. But there are two distinct aspects of NLP that I found to be unbelievably effective at helping me make changes in other people, specifically salespeople. And the first one is this process of anchoring and how it relates to state management. That's an NLP-based process, which I actually then take it up another level by some of my own experiences using a sense of smell, and we'll get there. Okay? So it's very, very powerful. And the second process is in the changing of some of your core beliefs. Where you actually take some of your old limiting beliefs that have been holding you back from achieving the success you're truly capable of, and we root them out using an NLP process, and we actually replace them with empowering beliefs of your choice that allow you to essentially propel yourself to massive success in sales. So the question is, how do you actually train your body to go into the states that you want to be in more often, meaning those empowered states? And the answer is very simple. You learn to do it through a process called anchoring. And what anchoring means essentially is to lock in, or to deeply anchor in, as the phrase goes, a state that serves you so deeply, in fact, that it almost becomes part of who you are. So you can then trigger that anchor, or fire off the anchor, as the phrase goes, which is the same as saying triggering a peak state at will. To put it simply, all an anchor is basically a learned association between a specific state and a specific trigger. Let me give you a quick example. You've probably heard of Pavlov's dogs, right? It's an experiment done many years ago by a Russian psychologist named Pavlov, and he trained these dogs to salivate every time they heard a dinner bell, even in the absence of food. Now, the way he did this was by simultaneously ringing a dinner bell every time he fed them a piece of meat. And he did this again and again and again, more than 100 times, in fact. So he fed them some meat, rang a bell, fed them meat, rang a bell, fed meat, rang a bell, right? And eventually, he could just ring the bell, and the dogs would start to salivate even in the absence of meat. It was the anticipation of the coming meat that caused the response, okay? Now, the bell in this case is what's called the anchor. And when you ring the bell, it's called firing off your anchor. And the good news is that while we're not dogs, we can use this process for ourselves to trigger any particular state we want, regardless of how we're feeling at that moment. In other words, we can set anchors for ourselves for things like confidence and clarity and certainty. So even if we're not actually feeling those things, we can actually fire off our anchor and trigger those empowering states at will. And the best news of all about this, by the way, is that unlike drugs, which you typically need more and more of to get the same effect, it's the exact opposite when it comes to anchoring. You see, when you fire off an anchor, the more you do it, the easier it gets to fire it off and the more powerful the response is. So that being said, let's cut to the live footage now, and I'll show you exactly how to set an anchor for yourself. And I'll see you in a few minutes. So when I started getting into neurolinguistic programming with Bandler, what the basic way of, it's called anchoring, is where you actually learn to trigger an emotion that you want by setting what's called an anchor. Let's say I want to, at any time I want, get into a peak state of certainty. I want to feel certain. So what I do, okay, is I go back to a moment in my life and I get myself feeling absolutely certain about what happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago. For me, here's my anchor. I go back to the night that I invented the straight line. It was that night that I drew that straight line on the board and said, don't you guys get it? Every sale's the same. There's an open, there's a close. And I remember looking out at the people, and I go back to that moment, and I imagine what I was wearing, how I was feeling, and I close my eyes, and I actually squeeze my fists so I feel my own fingernails digging in, and I say yes, and I just go back and I get myself feeling as I felt. I look out through my own eyes and I see what I was seeing. The people sitting in front of me, hear what I was saying. I watched their heads nodding and like, oh my God, like, and I was in front. I get that unbelievable, give myself that feeling of being in charge and knowing. When I knew I cracked the code. I knew that night, I said, I got it. I know how to train these people. I can do it. I'm going to be rich. And I went on and on for hours, and everyone was writing it down and writing stuff down. And I get myself really worked up into that moment. I say yes, and I say yeah, and I walk around in a room myself. Before I give a seminar, I'll do this. I'll say yes, and I go back and I say act as if, and I'll smack my hand into mine. I'll create a noise for myself. I'm alone. Then I'll go into one of my own language patterns that I had. Act if you're wealthy, man, rich, already, you become rich. Act, and I get myself, everyone see what I do? I get myself pumped up, and I say yes. And I smack my own, my anchor for certainty. We all have an anchor. We're feeling certain. Some people do this, some people do this, some people do this, I do this. Everyone's different, okay? And I say yes. And then what I do is I take this thing here. It's this really pungent smell that I found, and I go, that's right, and I go yes, and I get this wild smell. And as soon as that smell touches my brain, boom, I'm back to where I was that first night when I invented the straight. I actually added this on afterwards. The beautiful thing about your brain, you can change and add things on. You can change your memory. You can strengthen a memory. You can make it better than it was. And unlike drugs, which become less and less over time, this becomes more powerful. The more you do it, the stronger the anchor becomes. Everyone get that? Who's ever been in a car and got pulled over by the cops? Raise your hand. When you first heard that sound, what did you do? Boom, boom, boom. Your heart was beating before your mind even knew what happened. Instantly, your blood, that's an anchor. So what I have done now by repetition and training, I've actually got it to the point now where I could be sitting in my room in a low energy, neutral state, and you go, yes, and go, and bam, I'm absolutely certain. So I say to myself, here's what I do. I say, well, I have two options. Either I can A, give a seminar, give a pub, I do keynotes all over the world, right, for companies. So I can do that and walk on stage and hope that I'm going to feel really good that day. I can give a seminar like this and hope I'm on that day. I hope I'm having a good day. Or I could take out any possibility and I trigger my anchor. Everyone get that? See, my commitment to excellence in my life is I'm not going to leave it up to chance. I'm going to tip the odds in my favor. There's so much in sales, guys, that we can't control. We can't control the quality of our leads. We can try, but there's going to be bad leads. You can't control what's happening in the stock market. You can't control what's happening with the financial product you're selling. You can't control almost anything in this world, but what you can control is the state that you're in before you pick up that phone or before you walk in the door. So I say to myself, why leave it up to chance? I want to tip the odds in my favor. So I anchor myself into a peak state of certainty, of clarity, of confidence, courage every single time.